Here is where you put the start point of the lesson, boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen, and super intelligent shades of the colour sky blue pink. Here we go. When someone puts a paper in front of me and says, here's a paper that absolutely proves Bart Kay wrong, here are the questions you ask straight away. Number one, is the study that's being put in front of you a controlled observation in a metabolic ward lock-in situation on human beings? Is this an experimental piece of science under control? Because if it's not, in terms of discussion about cause and effect, we are done right there. Okay? Association, which is what most studies are. Most studies on human beings are associative, prospective, cohort style studies. These are incapable, underline incapable, twice, put that in block capitals if that's required, incapable of informing on cause and effect. I'll give you an example. If I do an associative study where I look at the sale of ice creams at Miami Beach on any given hot summer's day, and I correlate that with the incidence of sunburn suffered by people at Miami Beach that same day, I will find a very strong correlation between, on any given day, if I do this over multiple days throughout the summer, I am going to find a correlation between the sale of ice cream and the incidence of sunburn, am I not? Yes. Does that mean we deal with the sunburn problem by outlawing the sale of ice creams? No, that's ridiculous. That is what we're dealing with mostly in nutrition science, health science, etc. Why is that so? Well, it's very difficult financially, practically, and ethically to lock people in a laboratory for multiple decades in order to talk about the effect of any given intervention on people's health over multiple decades. You will not get that past ethics, ever. And even if you did, where is the money for a multiple decadal lock-in study coming from? And who's going to run it? What's the practicalities of that? Okay, so the response to that I normally get from people, indeed boys with high school diplomas who must know more than me about science because you see they can bench press 415 pounds, Richard Burgess, goodness sake, is that, oh, well, the problem, Bart Kay, is that your epistemological standards are just unreasonable. No. What they're basically saying there is that Bart Kay is a science denier. No. Bart Kay insists upon science. I hope that's a clear distinction. What I'm saying is, to be unassailable in your argumentation, your discipline has to be unassailable. And if you are going to suggest that an associative study is able to inform on cause and effect, your credibility is done. Right there, you're finished. So that's the first thing. The first question is, okay, this study that I'm being shown that proves me wrong, is it a properly controlled, properly observed, properly tenured metabolic ward lock-in study, an experimental piece of science? No? We're done. I hope that's really clear. Any questions on that?
Yeah, I would say one, just to prove your point and what you're saying. I could say to you, well, Professor Kay, we never did that with smoking and lung cancer, for example.
Right.
We never did a randomized controlled trial, and today that would also be considered ethical. Can you tell us the difference between the levels of association and why that matters to validate some associative studies out there, but why that doesn't work with nutrition?
Absolutely. And that is also a brilliant segue to point number 2 as well, just serendipitously, because Casey and I haven't discussed this beforehand.
No, it's not.
I've just said, look, I'd like to outlay these 5 things. But anyway, let's deal with that. An association between A and B has a certain value. There is a relationship between A and B for which we can draw a trend line, a line of best fit. It's called a regression line for those that want to know the mathematical term for it. What we have to understand is how powerful is that predictive value, they call it. It's not predictive. In fact, it's associative and it's nothing else, by the way. Some predictive values have more, weight in that the variation of individual data points around that trend line is much narrower. People fit the line better, or they fit the line worse. Okay? So, for example, you could say that there was an association between X and Y that has a value, a slope on that trend line of 1 to 1. So for every value of X, there is an added value of Y. That's a straight line that goes up at 45 degrees through that graph, shall we say. However, if individual people are scattered all over that chart and nowhere near the actual trend line, the best fit line, then the R-squared value, the predictive value of that chart, is close to zero. Ergo, while you can say, well, the best fit through that line is a one-to-one relationship, in actual fact, people are hugely variant around that. There is massive noise around that signal, in which case that trend line is of no value to you, sort of thing, okay? In the case of smoking, of tobacco, and the incidence of lung cancer, the relationship is quite strong in that, don't quote me on the exact numbers, but I believe it's in the order of, for every pack year of smoking, a pack year meaning 20 cigarettes a day for a year, for every one of those exposures, there is an 11,500% increase in the incidence of lung cancers. Now, is that a cause and effect relationship? I might have an opinion on that, personally, because that's a pretty powerful finding. The noise around it is not huge. The scientific discipline requires me to say, no, that's not a cause and effect relationship, at least it's not established as such, because this is an associative study which is still incapable of making that call. We have to apply a reasonable, sensible opinion. Okay, so my opinion personally is I'm just not going to smoke tobacco on a precautionary principle, because that's a pretty large increase in the incidence of an outcome associated with an input. In the case of anything whatsoever that you can talk about in terms of the outcome, hard health outcomes in human beings as that relates to any aspect of human nutrition or most pharmacological drugs, the differences are so close to zero with such massive noise as that those data sets are meaningless, worthless. They're a joke to anyone who understands statistics at all. That's the problem. So, question number one, do we have an experimental data set that eliminates covariates, collinearities, confounders, controls absolutely everything except the experimental variable to establish cause and effect? No, it's an associative study. Great. Let's say there's an association and make our own opinions about the meaning of that association with an understanding of the value of its power to make predictions, shall we say, to use that terminology. That's fine. If we go over the line, however, and say this study here shows cause and effect when it does not, your credibility as a scientist or someone that comments on science is now done because you've broken the rules. You're over the line. Now, boys with high school diplomas, as I said, will say that's epistemologically unreasonable. No, what's unreasonable is making a claim that you cannot support. I'm unassailable. I'm in the right here, whether you like it or whether you don't like it. Sorry about that, Richard Burgess, and others. Others with much more credibility than Richard Burgess make this same mistake, by the way. So that's the first question. The second question, okay, if you've got an associative study, let's talk about the power of that association. What is the slope of the line and what is the noise around it? And if you're unable to do that by looking at a data set yourself, then you, my friend, are not competent to publicly make any statement whatsoever about what the science says. Sorry. And as such, you should keep your mouth shut on that topic. So that's point 2. Point number 3 is a thing we call repeatability. Sometimes it's referred to as reliability. Here's what it is. If I measure your, well, let's go with an example that's from real life, from a study that I was involved in a few years ago. There's this idea that when exercise is undertaken, there is a buildup of lactate in the blood of the athletes undertaking the exercise, and the level of the lactate in the blood bears one of these relationships with the exercise intensity, the relative exercise intensity, relative to that individual athlete's maximum, i.e. the closer they are to their maximum, the higher the output of this substance lactate in their blood. And often this lactate level is used as a predictor of performance, falsely, but that's for another day. And it's also used as a gauge of training response after a period of training, also falsely, but that's also for another day. The point here is this. What we did, myself and some colleagues, is we got a bunch of cyclists to come into the lab on the same day of the week, 6 weeks in a row, having had the same breakfast that morning, having, this, that, the other, all the things that we could possibly get them to control as close to a proper controlled study as possible, right? And basically what we did is, under the assumption that everything else is under control and everything else is the same, what we're just doing is measuring the same athlete 6 weeks in a row without changing anything else. So there should be stability, concordance, an agreement between their blood lactate concentrations at any given work intensity 6 weeks in a row, assuming that they're not under a period of training where we would expect that to change. Right? Did we get that? Hell no, excuse my French. Absolutely not. What we got was a spread of results for a given individual under the same circumstances pretty much that was so wide that a change in fitness status to detect with statistical power, which we'll talk about last, was so wide as to be completely unrealistic. In other words, there's no way we can detect this change and say statistically this is significant, this has power, this is meaningful, this has utility. Because a person measured again and again and again and again for the same variable was so all over the place that the noise around the signal rendered the signal useless. Most studies report signals. Signal means change in the variable from situation A to situation B, okay? The noise around these signals in the literature is invariably so massive as to make the whole paper laughable to anybody who understands statistics at all. And yet, people are saying the science shows, and they're splashing these papers up on the screen with conclusions from authors that are worded in such a way as to suggest that the paper is able to inform us in any usable way at all, when it's not, bought and paid for. And they're going, there you go, there's proof. The only thing that's proof of, my friend, is that you, if you're making those kind of comments out there, that you are incompetent to talk about the science. I hope this is going up some flagpoles. So that's number 3. Number 1, do we have an experimental study under control here? No, we're done. We have an association. Let's talk about associations, coincidental factors, and nothing else. Okay, all right, maybe we do have some kind of controlled study. Is the signal better than, or does it emerge from the noise? Is it a clear signal of utility, or do we just have noise here that could well be random? And when people say, well, this is statistically significant, that does not mean you're outside a signal to noise ratio problem. Statistical significance refers to a finding which is, usually its p is less than 0.05, which means there is less than a 5% chance that the difference between situation A and situation B in terms of our outcome variable, there's a 5% chance or less that that difference has occurred through parsimoniously, through dumb chance, and that it's not actually due cause and effect to the intervention that we've imposed. The way to get statistical significance on a very, very small change in signal is to have a very, very large sample size. Because statistically, mathematically, that reduces the chance that that very, very small difference was due to dumb chance, and that it has something to do with whatever we've intervened on. However, that does not tell us that it's useful clinically or meaningfully in the real world. So hopefully that's a clear distinction. The fourth point, the fourth question is, once we get through all of that, if we do have a well-controlled experimental study, the signal stands out from the noise, it's clear, there's very little noise, there's very little variability. We can repeat the study any number of times we like and get the same result, not a different one. Here's my next question then. Please tell me about the statistical power, not the significance value, the power of this study. What is power? Well, mathematically, it's 1.0 minus the beta probability. For those that want to do the math, the beta probability is when you take two normal distribution curves, which is what you normally get when you measure people for anything, you get a normal curve mostly, and you move one of those bell-shaped curves with respect to the other one, so the value of the mean, the average, if you like, is different in these two charts that you're superimposing. The alpha value, 0.05, is how far does the mean move from the other mean with respect to the original mean? How many Z scores does it move? How many standard deviations does it move? Okay, 1.96 standard deviations, p is less than 0.05. Fantastic. What that doesn't account for is everything on the left, shall we say, if we've got an increase, everything on the left of the second situation, the increased one, everything below the mean value, that falls below that 0.05 level, that's the tail of the other curve, and it's the probability of a type 2 error. So type 1 error is a false positive, 0.05. Probability of a false negative, where we declare something to be insignificant when really it actually is, that's the beta probability. So power, the power of a study is 1 minus the beta probability. What we need in science, by way of just being an arbitrary decision made by those that have decided what the disciplines should be, is they say any study that has a power less than 0.08 is not reliable. So the next question I ask people is, great, we've got through the first three, that tick, 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 yes, great. What's the power of the study? And usually what you'll get is that the person will respond to you with an open mouth and silence, because they don't know. In which case, my friend, guess what? You are not competent to speak about what the science shows publicly. And as such, you should keep your mouth shut on the topic. You need to understand this. You need to be able to do this mathematics yourself on a data set. Okay, people that think you can read a paper and its conclusions and be competent to talk about what the science says, it's ridiculous. That would be like me claiming to be competent to be a psychiatrist. I'm not trained in psychiatry. Someone like Paul Saladino is. He's a psychiatrist, although he doesn't practice and never has, by the way, not one single day in his life. He went straight to being a social media influencer, having completed his rotation in psychiatry. So Paul Saladino is a trained allopathic doctor, MD, and he's done a rotation in psychiatry, so he is now a qualified psychiatrist, despite never practicing. What does that mean? It means Paul Saladino is competent to speak publicly to people about psychiatry or allopathic medicine, not what the science says. In the same way that I absolutely am competent, very competent, to speak about what the science says, I am not competent to speak about psychiatry. People need to understand this. Most notably, people who are psychiatrists need to understand this, and they need to stop making comments about what the science says, because they are not competent. I hope that's clear. In the same way that if I burst a pipe in my house, I'm not going to ring an electrician. I'm going to ring a plumber. That's just common sense, surely. Anyway, that said, those are the top 4. So, experimental study, properly controlled, was it? Okay. Is the signal to noise ratio good? Can we see a clear signal out with the noise? Good. Yes. Okay. Is the study repeatable? Could we do this again and again and again and get the same result? Yes or no? Does it have statistical power? Is 1 minus beta above 0.8? Fantastic. 4 out of 5. Let's see if we've got the 5th thing sorted out. And it goes a bit like this. If I want to talk about the likely outcome in a given human being or group of human beings over a given period of time, let's say multiple decades, do I have a study that is controlled, has good signal to noise ratio, good repeatability, acceptable power, that lasted as long as the assertion that I'm about to make? So if I'm going to say over 4 decades, 5 decades, here's what we can expect by way of outcome, do I have a study that was conducted for 4 or 5 decades on human beings locked into a lab, observed under control? So if we get through the first 4, which is very, very rare indeed, as rare as rocking horse poo, then we ask question 5. Great. How long did that study go on for? James De Nicolantonio. Oh, 10 weeks. Ergo, what can we say about 11 weeks? Or 3 months? Or 3 years? Or 30? Not a damned thing. We cannot extrapolate a trend observed over one time frame to a longer time frame. We do not know that the signal that we saw will continue unchanged. We do not know that a straight line will continue to be straight. We do not know that a curvilinear function will continue in that vein. It may turn around, flatten, and go back down again. So, when you are presented with a study that absolutely proves X, Y, or Z as regards hard human health outcomes, with respect to pretty much anything nutritionally or pharmacologically or any of that stuff, those are the 5 questions. Normally, you don't need to get past question 1. But if you do, there are 4 more questions that you can ask there that can absolutely tip that over. You will win that argument, and I say win with inverted speech marks around it because there's no such thing as winning an argument, by the way. There is no such thing, I can promise you. What you can do, however, though, is show your comprehension, your understanding of the disciplines of inference making in science, and you can show superiority to another person's argument simply by tapping those 5 questions in order.